What if the ground beneath one of the most guarded cities on Earth was quietly hollowed out, not by an invading army, not by bombs or tanks, but by men with shovels, blueprints, and absolute silence? What if, while the Cold War raged above the surface, soldiers staring each other down, tanks idling at checkpoints, diplomats trading threats, there was a secret war unfolding underground? A war where sound itself was the weapon. A war where whispers, phone calls, and coded Soviet conversations were worth more than any missile. This is not a theory. This is not a conspiracy. This happened. Beneath the divided city of Berlin in the mid-1950s, the United States and its allies built one of the most daring espionage operations in modern history. A hidden tunnel designed to listen to the KGB and the Soviet military without them knowing. Welcome to Untold Golden History. This is the true story of the Berlin spy tunnel. In 1954, Berlin was not just a city, it was the most dangerous place on Earth. World War II had ended less than a decade earlier, but peace was fragile and artificial. Germany was split in two, and Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, was sliced into sectors like a living corpse. West Berlin belonged to the Americans, British, and French. East Berlin belonged to the Soviet Union. Concrete borders had not yet fully risen, but invisible lines were everywhere. Crossing the wrong street could change your life forever. American intelligence knew something crucial. If World War III were to begin, it would begin here. The Soviets knew it too. That made Berlin the ultimate intelligence battlefield. Every embassy was bugged. Every waiter could be a spy. Every phone call was suspect. And yet, the most valuable Soviet communications were still traveling through ordinary underground cables, telephone and telegraph lines buried beneath East Berlin streets, carrying conversations between Soviet military headquarters, KGB command centers, and Moscow itself. To American intelligence, those cables were irresistible. Listening to them could mean knowing Soviet troop movements before they happened, knowing nuclear readiness levels, knowing whether peace or war was coming. But tapping those lines inside East Berlin was impossible, at least on the surface. So the CIA decided to go underground. The idea did not begin in Washington. It began in desperation. In the early 1950s, U.S. intelligence was operating almost blind behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet counterintelligence was ruthless, efficient, and paranoid. Western spy networks were collapsing one by one. Agents disappeared. Radio signals were traced. Entire operations were rolled up overnight. The CIA needed a breakthrough. That breakthrough came from an unexpected place: British intelligence. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, had experience with underground tapping operations during World War II. They proposed something radical. Instead of placing listening devices inside East Berlin, why not intercept the cables themselves from the safety of the Western sector? It sounded insane. It sounded impossible. It sounded exactly like the kind of plan Cold War intelligence thrived on. The Americans agreed. The operation was given a bland, harmless name to hide its true purpose. The CIA called it Operation Gold. The British called it Operation Stopwatch. Behind those names was a plan that would require flawless secrecy, revolutionary engineering, and nerves of steel. Because if the Soviets discovered the tunnel before it was operational, it wouldn't just be a failed mission. It could trigger an international crisis, or worse, a war. The first challenge was geography. The Soviet communication cables were buried deep inside East Berlin. The only way to reach them without crossing the border was to dig a tunnel from West Berlin, long enough to pass beneath the border undetected, deep enough to avoid surface vibrations, and precise enough to intersect a cable bundle no wider than a man's arm. There would be no second chances. One wrong measurement could expose the entire operation. Engineers studied old German maps, wartime construction records, and Soviet utility layouts. They analyzed soil composition, groundwater levels, and underground infrastructure. They discovered something critical. Berlin's soil was mostly sand and clay, easy to dig, but dangerously unstable. The tunnel would need reinforcement every step of the way, and it would need to be silent, because above them, East German patrols walked the streets, trams rattled past, Soviet trucks rolled over the pavement. Any unusual vibration could raise suspicion. This was not just engineering, this was underground espionage warfare. Construction began in absolute secrecy in 1954. The entrance was hidden inside a nondescript warehouse in West Berlin, officially listed as a storage facility. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Inside, it was one of the most classified sites in the Cold War. Workers were carefully vetted. Many did not know what they were building or why. They were told only what they needed to know. Digging took place mostly at night. Soil was removed in small quantities and quietly disposed of to avoid drawing attention. Timber supports were installed immediately to prevent collapse. Air circulation systems were installed to prevent suffocation. Every inch was measured, every foot was mapped. The tunnel slowly crept eastward, inch by inch, day by day, beneath one of the most heavily surveilled areas in the world. Above ground, the Cold War continued as usual. Below ground, history was being rewritten. After months of digging, the tunnel reached its target zone. Engineers carefully expanded a small chamber where the cable interception would take place. Inside that chamber, CIA and MI6 technicians prepared one of the most advanced wiretapping systems ever built. They didn't just want to listen, they wanted everything. The system was designed to record thousands of hours of conversations, military briefings, intelligence updates, logistical coordination, most of it transmitted in what Soviet officials believed was a secure landline network. The irony was brutal. The Soviets trusted their underground cables more than radio transmissions, believing physical lines were safer from interception. They never imagined the Americans would dig beneath the city itself. And when the final connections were made and the first recordings began to roll, American intelligence officers realized the magnitude of what they had achieved. They were listening to the enemy breathe. From 1955 onward, the tunnel delivered an intelligence flood. Soviet officers discussed troop deployments. KGB agents coordinated counterintelligence operations. Logistical units reported fuel shortages, equipment failures, and personnel movements. Some conversations were routine, others were explosive. American analysts worked around the clock, translating Russian and East German communications, cross-referencing them with satellite imagery, human intelligence, and diplomatic signals. For the first time since the Iron Curtain fell, the United States had a real-time window into Soviet military thinking in Europe. The information was so valuable that it reshaped NATO planning. It confirmed that some Western fears were exaggerated and others dangerously underestimated. It revealed internal Soviet disagreements. It exposed weaknesses. It saved lives. And yet, there was a terrifying truth the CIA did not know. From the very beginning, the Soviets may have already known about the tunnel. Unknown to American planners, British intelligence had been compromised. A high-ranking MI6 officer, trusted, respected, deeply embedded, was secretly working for the Soviet Union. His name would later become infamous in Cold War history. And through him, the KGB learned about the tunnel almost as soon as the plan existed. But instead of stopping it immediately, the Soviets made a calculated decision. They let it continue. Why? Because a known leak is sometimes more useful than a sealed one. The KGB fed controlled information through the tapped lines, true enough to be believable, limited enough to avoid catastrophe. They allowed the Americans to think they had won, while carefully managing what was exposed. It was a masterclass in counterintelligence deception. The tunnel became both a triumph and a trap. And eventually, the moment would come when the Soviets would reveal it on their terms. That moment arrived in April 1956. East German authorities announced the discovery of a criminal espionage tunnel beneath their territory. Soviet engineers and journalists were invited to the site. Photographs were taken, propaganda films were made. The tunnel was no longer a secret. The world watched as the Soviets exposed the underground war beneath Berlin. For the CIA, the revelation was devastating and strangely validating. Yes, the tunnel had been compromised. Yes, it had been discovered. But for nearly a year, it had worked. And in the silent chess match of the Cold War, even temporary advantage could change history. But the story of the Berlin Tunnel does not end with its discovery. Its legacy shaped intelligence operations for decades. It exposed the limits of secrecy. It revealed the danger of internal betrayal. And it proved that in the Cold War, the most powerful weapons were not bombs or bullets, but information. Beneath the streets of Berlin, a tunnel once listened to an empire. And for a brief moment, the silence spoke. When the Soviets publicly revealed the tunnel in April 1956, the world believed the story was over. Newspapers ran dramatic headlines. East German propaganda films showed uniformed officers pointing at exposed cables like trophies. Western journalists spoke of embarrassment, failure, and defeat. But underground intelligence wars do not end when the cameras leave. For the CIA, the real story was only beginning. Inside Langley, analysts did not see the Berlin Tunnel as a disaster. They saw it as a paradox, an operation that had been technically compromised, but operationally successful. For almost a year, American intelligence had listened to the heartbeat of the Soviet military in Europe. That alone justified the risk. And yet, a haunting question echoed through every classified debriefing room. How much of what we heard was real? The Cold War was not fought with certainty. It was fought with probabilities. Every intercepted message from the tunnel was reanalyzed after its exposure. Analysts went back through transcripts, searching for patterns that might reveal Soviet manipulation. Were certain conversations too perfect, too revealing, too conveniently timed? Some intelligence officers argued the KGB had played a long deception game, feeding selective truths while hiding critical secrets. Others believed the Soviets underestimated the value of what was being leaked and lost control of the situation. The truth, as always in espionage, lay somewhere in between. The tunnel had given the U.S. confirmation of Soviet force structures in East Germany. It revealed how Soviet command chains actually worked in practice, not just on paper. It showed delays, confusion, disagreements, human flaws inside a system that projected absolute strength. Those insights changed NATO's strategy. For the first time, Western planners understood that the Red Army was not a monolithic machine. It was vast, powerful, but strained, logistically and psychologically. That understanding mattered, because Europe was a hair trigger. In the mid-1950s, nuclear weapons were no longer theoretical. The United States had used them. The Soviet Union had tested them. Both sides were racing to build delivery systems that could reach across continents in minutes. Berlin sat at the center of that nightmare. If war came, the city would be erased. That made intelligence priceless, and it made betrayal unforgivable. As the dust settled from the tunnel's exposure, attention turned inward toward the question no intelligence agency ever wants to face: who betrayed us? Suspicion fell first on the technical teams, then on Berlin station officers, then, inevitably, on the British. MI6 had been a partner from the start. Their experience, their engineering knowledge, their political cover had been essential, yet somehow the Soviets had known. The answer would take years to fully emerge, but when it did, it would shake Western intelligence to its core. The man responsible had a polished accent, impeccable credentials, and a career built on trust. He attended high-level meetings, he advised policymakers, he knew secrets that could topple governments. His name was Kim Philby. Philby was not just a spy, he was a ghost inside the system. Recruited by Soviet intelligence decades earlier, he had risen through the ranks of British intelligence while secretly serving Moscow. By the time of the Berlin Tunnel, he was positioned perfectly to leak information without raising suspicion. When the plan for the tunnel reached his desk, he passed it on. And yet, even Philby could not predict how the Soviets would use that information. The KGB faced a dilemma. If they shut the tunnel down immediately, they would expose their knowledge of Western plans, risking the loss of their most valuable asset inside MI6. If they let it continue, they risked real intelligence loss. Their solution was cold and calculated. They let the tunnel live, but they watched it carefully. Soviet engineers quietly rerouted some communications. Sensitive messages were shifted to alternative channels. Less critical but still believable information continued to flow through the tapped lines. The Americans, unaware of the betrayal, listened intently. Both sides believed they were outsmarting the other. That is the essence of the Cold War espionage. For CIA field officers in Berlin, the tunnel represented the peak of human ingenuity under pressure. Many of them never learned about Philby until years later. At the time, they believed discovery was inevitable, not because of betrayal, but because no secret lasts forever. Berlin was saturated with spies. The Americans spied on the Soviets spied on the Americans, the East Germans spied on everyone. Even allies watched each other. The city was a living intelligence organism, constantly adapting, constantly mutating. And the tunnel, for all its brilliance, was one piece of a much larger machine. After the tunnel's exposure, U.S. intelligence shifted strategy. Instead of massive engineering projects, they turned increasingly towards human intelligence, recruiting insiders, defectors, and double agents. The risks were higher, but the rewards were more precise. Technology advanced too. Listening devices became smaller. Signals intelligence moved into the electromagnetic spectrum. Satellites would soon watch from above, making underground tunnels less essential. But the lessons of Berlin endured. The tunnel taught intelligence agencies that boldness could pay off, but only if paired with ruthless internal security. It showed that technical success meant nothing without trust. And it revealed a truth few wanted to admit. The greatest threat was not the enemy outside, it was the enemy already in the room. For Berliners, the tunnel was just another chapter in a city used as a chessboard. Families were divided, streets were divided, lives were divided. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, many remembered the tunnel, not as a failure, but as a warning. If nations were willing to dig beneath the earth to spy on each other, they were willing to do anything to maintain power. The ground beneath Berlin had always been unstable. Now everyone knew why. Decades later, after the Cold War ended and archives were opened, historians pieced together the full story. Declassified documents confirmed the scope, its success, and its compromise. What emerged was not a tale of simple victory or defeat, but of human ambition pushed to its limits. engineers who worked in silence, analysts who listened to voices they would never see, spies who betrayed friends without blinking, and a city that bore the weight of it all. The Berlin Tunnel was not just a hole in the ground, it was a mirror. It reflected the fear, brilliance, paranoia, and courage of an era when the world stood one misunderstanding away from annihilation. And for a brief moment, deep beneath the streets of Berlin, the United States listened, and the Soviet Union spoke, unaware that history itself was recording every word. Long after the tunnel was sealed and filled with concrete, its echoes never disappeared. Inside classified CIA training rooms in the late 1950s, instructors spoke of Berlin in lowered voices. The city was no longer just a front line, it was a warning. Every map, every cable, every intercepted call from the tunnel became a lesson burned into institutional memory. Never assume secrecy is permanent. Never assume allies are clean. Never assume the enemy is stupid. The Berlin Tunnel had shattered those illusions. And yet, paradoxically, it also gave American intelligence something priceless: confidence. If such an audacious operation could be built beneath the Soviets' noses, then nothing, at least in theory, was impossible. The Cold War escalated. In Washington, policymakers studied tunnel intelligence while making decisions that affected millions. Soviet troop strength in Eastern Europe, readiness levels of armored divisions, communication bottlenecks between field commanders in Moscow. These were not abstract data points, they were countdown clocks. One misinterpreted signal could start a war. One missed signal could end a nation. The tunnel had sharpened America's understanding of how close the edge really was. Behind the scenes, the CIA launched internal reforms. Counterintelligence became obsessive, polygraphs increased, compartmentalization tightened. Officers were no longer trusted simply because of rank or reputation. The name Philby became synonymous with betrayal. Files once shared freely between Allied agencies were now locked behind layers of clearance. Information flowed slower, but safer. The tunnel had proven that intelligence depended not just on technology, but on psychology. Trust was the rarest currency of all. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB conducted its own reckoning. The tunnel was publicly portrayed as a Western failure, but internally, Soviet leadership knew the truth was more complicated. Allowing the tunnel to operate, even in a controlled way, had been a gamble. Some Soviet officers believed it paid off, others believed it risked catastrophic exposure. Debates raged inside closed rooms. Should they have shut it down immediately? Had the deception gone too far? Had they underestimated American analytical capability? The KGB, like the CIA, learned that intelligence victories were never clean. Berlin itself transformed. The city absorbed the tunnel story into its mythology, another secret buried beneath bomb scars and ruins. Few citizens knew where it had been. Fewer still understood its scale, but everyone felt the tension. In cafes, conversations stopped when unfamiliar faces entered. In apartment buildings, neighbors listened through walls. Even children sensed something unspoken in the air. Berlin was not just divided by ideology, it was divided by fear. In August 1961, that fear solidified into concrete and barbed wire. The Berlin Wall went up overnight. For many intelligence officers who had worked on the tunnel, the wall felt like a final verdict. The underground war had moved above ground. No more ambiguity, no more pretense. The Cold War had drawn a visible scar across the city. And yet, even as the wall rose, the legacy of the tunnel lived on in new forms. Signals intelligence evolved. Where once engineers dug through sand and clay, they now pierced the atmosphere. Early reconnaissance satellites, primitive by modern standards, began photographing Soviet territory from space. The battlefield shifted from underground chambers to orbital paths, but the logic remained the same. Listen without being seen. Know before being known. The tunnel was no longer a blueprint, but it was a philosophy. Former CIA officers who had worked on Operation Gold carried its lessons into future crises. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, intelligence analysts remembered Berlin. They remembered how close misunderstanding could bring catastrophe. They pushed for verification. They demanded multiple sources. They refused to trust a single channel. That caution helped prevent nuclear war. In that sense, the tunnel may have saved the world, not through what it heard, but through what it taught. Years later, when Cold War veterans were interviewed, many spoke of the tunnel with a strange affection. Not pride, not regret, something deeper. It represented a moment when human ingenuity challenged geopolitical fate, when engineers, linguists, analysts, and spies worked together in absolute secrecy, believing their work mattered. And it did. The tunnel was never meant to last forever. It was meant to exist just long enough to matter, and it succeeded. As archives opened in the 1990s, historians reconstructed the full operation in staggering detail. Maps showed the tunnel's precise route. Transcripts revealed conversations once thought lost. Internal memos exposed doubts, fears, and last-minute decisions. What emerged was not a Hollywood fantasy, but something more compelling. Real people, real risks, real consequences. No single hero, no single villain, just a system under pressure. Berlin today stands unified, vibrant, and free. Tourists walk streets unaware of what lies beneath their feet. The tunnel no longer exists, but the ground remembers. Every city has secrets. Berlin simply had better ones. And beneath one of the most guarded borders in history, there was once a passage where sound itself became a weapon, where whispers crossed ideological divides, and where history listened in silence. Even after Berlin was physically sealed by the wall, intelligence officers knew something the public did not. Walls could stop people. They could not stop information. The memory of the tunnel lingered like a ghost beneath the concrete. It shaped how the United States thought about secrecy, about surveillance, and about how far a nation should go to protect itself without firing a single shot. And nowhere were those questions more urgent than inside the minds of the men who had ordered the tunnel in the first place. In Washington, senior officials revisited Operation Gold again and again, not to relive glory, but to dissect every decision. They wanted to know which risks had been necessary and which had been reckless. The digging itself had been flawless. The engineering had been revolutionary. The listening technology had worked exactly as designed. The failure, if it could be called that, had come from human trust. That realization haunted the intelligence community, because technology could be upgraded, soil could be measured, steel could be reinforced, but loyalty could not be engineered. As the 1960s unfolded, American intelligence quietly shifted toward redundancy. No single operation would ever again carry such strategic weight alone. Signals intelligence would be paired with human intelligence. Satellite imagery would be checked against intercepted communications. Nothing would stand alone. This philosophy, born from the Berlin Tunnel, became doctrine. It also fueled an explosion in intelligence funding. Congress, briefed behind closed doors, approved budgets that dwarfed anything seen before. New agencies expanded, new laboratories opened, new generations of analysts were trained with Berlin as their case study. For them, the tunnel was not ancient history. It was a warming etched into concrete. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviets reached similar conclusions, but from the opposite direction. The KGB tightened control over landline communications. Encryption became standard. Sensitive conversations were moved to secure facilities where even walls were suspect. Paranoia became policy. The tunnel had proven that no space, no matter how deep, was beyond reach. This realization hardened the Soviet state, and it made détente more fragile. The Cold War was no longer just about armies. It was about perception. Who knew what? Who believed whom? And who was lying best? The Berlin Tunnel was one of the first operations to show that intelligence itself could be weaponized, not merely as information, but as influence. If you could convince the enemy you were listening, even when you weren't, you could shape their behavior. That idea would echo through decades of psychological operations. By the late 1960s, former tunnel engineers began retiring quietly. Many never spoke publicly. Their work remained classified. Their families knew only fragments. Some carried guilt. They wondered whether the tunnel had made Berlin safer or more dangerous, whether listening had prevented war or merely delayed it. There were no clear answers, only probabilities. Then came the 1970s, and with them, a reckoning. The United States entered a period of deep mistrust in its institutions. Vietnam, Watergate, and intelligence scandals forced a public confrontation with the secret state. For the first time, Congress demanded oversight. Secret operations were questioned, files were subpoenaed, testimony was compelled. The CIA was no longer untouchable. And in those hearings, the ghost of the Berlin Tunnel resurfaced. Though Operation Gold remained classified, its philosophy was scrutinized. How far should intelligence agencies go without public consent? What risks were acceptable? Who decided? The tunnel became a symbol, both of brilliance and of unchecked power. Some lawmakers praised it as a masterpiece of Cold War necessity. Others condemned it as a dangerous escalation that could have triggered war. Both were right. Behind closed doors, intelligence veterans defended the tunnel fiercely. They argued that without such operations, the United States would have stumbled blind into catastrophe, that knowing the enemy's intentions, even imperfectly, was better than guessing. And history seemed to support them. The Cold War ended without nuclear war. Berlin reunified. The wall fell. Perhaps listening had helped more than anyone would ever admit. In November 1989, as crowds tore down the Berlin Wall, former intelligence officers watched in silence. Some cried. They thought of the tunnel not as a relic of espionage, but as a reminder of how close the world had come to destroying itself. The underground war was finally over, or so it seemed. As Germany reunified, construction crews uncovered forgotten layers of the city: bunkers, shelters, hidden cables, abandoned chambers. Rumors circulated about the tunnel's remains. Most had been destroyed, but the idea of it captured the public imagination. Documentaries were planned, books were written. Historians raced to reconstruct the full story before witnesses passed away. And what they uncovered was astonishing. The tunnel was not merely an operation, it was a mindset, a belief that knowledge, even stolen knowledge, could stabilize a dangerous world. That belief would soon be tested again. In the digital age, espionage no longer required shovels. Fiber optic cables replaced copper lines, satellites replaced tunnels, algorithms replaced listening posts, but the logic was unchanged. Tap the flow, control the narrative, know before acting. The Berlin Tunnel was the ancestor of modern surveillance. Its DNA ran through every intelligence program that followed. When intelligence officers today study cyber espionage, they still reference Berlin. They ask the same questions. How much is too much? Who is watching the watchers? And what happens when secrecy fails? The tunnel does not answer those questions. It simply asks them. History rarely offers clean conclusions. The Berlin Tunnel was neither pure victory nor pure failure. It was a reflection of an era when fear drove innovation, and innovation reshaped the world. It showed that the Cold War was not just fought in summits and standoffs, but in darkness, beneath ordinary streets, where the most powerful weapon was silence. And even now, as Berlin thrives above ground, the memory of what once lay beneath remains, a reminder that the past is never as buried as we think. Long before historians argued about the tunnel, before politicians debated its morality, there were ordinary men working in extraordinary silence. They were engineers, electricians, translators, logistics officers, people whose names would never appear in newspapers. They did not carry guns. They carried notebooks, soldering tools, and the weight of consequences they barely spoke about. For them, the Berlin Tunnel was not an abstract strategy. It was personal. One of them was an American engineer in his early 30s, recruited from a civilian construction firm and sworn into secrecy with a document thicker than his engineering manuals. He was told only this: failure was not an option, and success could never be acknowledged. Every night he descended underground, measuring soil stability by touch as much as by instrument. Berlin's earth shifted constantly. One wrong vibration could collapse weeks of work or expose everything. Above him, trams passed. Below him, silence pressed in. He learned to work without sound. Another was a linguist, born to Russian immigrant parents in New York, who spent 12 hours a day listening to Soviet voices she would never meet. She learned their patterns, their habits, their stress points. She could tell rank by tone. She could tell fear by pauses. Some nights she heard jokes. Some nights she heard exhaustion. Once she heard a Soviet officer mention his daughter's birthday and then return to discussing troop logistics as if nothing mattered. She realized then that the enemy was human. That realization never left her. The tunnel turned voices into intelligence, but it also turned intelligence into burden. Analysts wrestled with ethical questions they were never trained to answer. If they knew an accident was coming, could they intervene without exposing the tunnel? If intercepted conversations hinted at internal Soviet purges, were they obligated to act or to stay silent? There were no clear rules, only consequences. In one intercepted call, Soviet officers discussed heightened readiness levels during a NATO exercise. The conversation was tense, ambiguous, and dangerous. Analysts debated its meaning for days. Was it routine? Was it preparation? Was it posturing? The tunnel did not give certainty. It gave responsibility. As months passed, stress accumulated. Tunnel workers suffered insomnia. Analysts developed nervous habits. Some drank too much. Others withdrew completely. They lived double lives, normal above ground, hypervigilant below. No one could talk about it. Not to spouses, not to friends, not to doctors. Secrecy was not just operational, it was psychological. When the tunnel was exposed, relief mixed with fear. Relief that the pressure was over. Fear that consequences were coming. Some workers were quietly reassigned. Others were sent home with medals they could never display. No public recognition, no closure. Just silence. Years later, some of them would speak, carefully, partially, long after the Cold War had cooled. They described the tunnel not as an act of aggression, but as an act of desperation. A desperate attempt to understand an adversary before misunderstanding destroyed the world. One former analyst recalled listening to the final days of the tunnel recordings. He knew something was wrong.
The conversations felt staged. The pauses were too neat, the tone too controlled. By the time the tunnel was publicly revealed, he was not surprised. He was disappointed, but not defeated. Because he knew what the tunnel had already given them: time. Time was the most valuable commodity of the Cold War. The tunnel bought time. Time to plan, time to verify, time to avoid panic. Even if the Soviets controlled part of the narrative, the Americans had learned how their adversary communicated under pressure. That knowledge could not be erased. Inside the KGB, there were men just like those Americans. Men who listened, men who calculated, men who worried. Some had argued against letting the tunnel operate. They feared leaks, mistakes, overconfidence. Others saw opportunity. One KGB officer reportedly said, "If they want to listen, let them listen. We will decide what they hear." It was not arrogance, it was strategy. The Cold War was not a contest of strength alone. It was a contest of patience. And patience favored those who could endure uncertainty. As decades passed, the people who built and listened through the tunnel aged quietly. Many never saw Berlin unified. Some died believing their work would remain forever buried. But history has a way of resurfacing secrets. When declassified transcripts were finally studied in full, historians noticed something remarkable. Despite deception, despite compromise, despite betrayal, many intercepted conversations were brutally honest. They revealed confusion, they revealed fear, they revealed doubt. The Soviet system, often portrayed as rigid and unstoppable, was fragile in ways no missile parade could hide. That insight alone reshaped how the West understood its rival. The tunnel humanized the enemy, and that may have been its most dangerous contribution. Because once you understand the enemy is human, war becomes harder to justify and easier to prevent. The Berlin Tunnel did not end the Cold War. It slowed it. It added friction to rash decisions. It injected doubt into certainty. It reminded leaders that the other side was listening too. In a world where miscalculation meant annihilation, doubt was survival. Today, intelligence professionals study the tunnel not for its technical brilliance, but for its human cost. They ask how secrecy affects those who carry it, how silence reshapes lives, how listening can change the listener. Those questions remain unanswered. The tunnel is gone, but its lessons are alive. In every intercepted signal, every classified briefing, every debate about surveillance and privacy. It stands as proof that history is not only written by leaders, but by those who listen in the dark, hoping their silence keeps the world alive a little longer.
By the time the 20th century reached its final decade, the world believed it had moved beyond tunnels. Espionage, people said, was now digital, invisible, weightless. No more mud on boots, no more collapsing ceilings, no more men listening through headphones in sealed rooms. But that belief was an illusion, because every modern intelligence operation still carried Berlin inside it. In the early 1990s, newly declassified files circulated quietly through intelligence schools. Young officers, too young to remember the wall, studied maps of a city that no longer existed in the same form. They traced the tunnel's route with their fingers, not to admire it, to understand what it cost. The instructors did not begin with technology. They began with psychology. They explained how fear shaped decisions on both sides, how the Americans feared blindness, how the Soviets feared infiltration, how those fears collided underground. They emphasized one truth above all others. The tunnel succeeded not because it was hidden, but because it exploited assumptions. The Soviets assumed the West would not dare. The Americans assumed secrecy could be controlled. Both were wrong, and both learned from it.
As intelligence agencies entered the digital era, the Berlin Tunnel became a metaphor. Fiber optic cables replaced copper wires, but the logic remained identical. Instead of digging through sand, agencies tapped undersea cables. Instead of microphones, they used packet capture systems. Instead of tape reels, they stored petabytes of data. But the ethical dilemma was unchanged. If you can listen, should you? And if you listen, what responsibility does that create? In the late 1990s and early 2000s, global surveillance programs expanded dramatically. Governments justified them using the same language once used to defend the tunnel. Prevention, stability, early warning. The words had not changed, only the scale had. Veterans of Cold War intelligence watched these developments with unease. Some felt vindicated. They had always known this was the direction history would take. Others felt dread. They remembered Berlin. They remembered how certainty had been an illusion even with targeted surveillance. They wondered what certainty meant when listening became nearly universal. The tunnel listened to thousands. Modern systems listened to millions. One retired CIA officer, interviewed years later, said something chillingly simple. The tunnel taught us that listening changes the listener. Scale only makes that more dangerous. The Berlin Tunnel also influenced how adversaries behaved. Russia, China, and other powers studied the operation closely. They did not see it as an American embarrassment. They saw it as a blueprint. If the United States could dig under Berlin, what might it do elsewhere? That question fueled countermeasures. Encrypted communications, air-gapped systems, human couriers. The dance between listening and hiding accelerated, and with it, mistrust. In some ways, the tunnel extended the Cold War into the present, not ideologically, but structurally. The world became accustomed to permanent surveillance tension. Nations assumed they were being listened to at all times. That assumption shaped diplomacy, military planning, and even public speech. Silence became performative. Yet the tunnel also left behind something unexpected: restraint. Because leaders who understood how much could be misinterpreted learned to hesitate. They learned that overheard words could mislead as easily as inform. The tunnel revealed not only secrets, but noise. That lesson mattered. During several post-Cold War crises, intelligence analysts cited Berlin when advising caution. They reminded policymakers how easily intercepted conversations could be misunderstood. They argued for context, for patience, for restraint. Sometimes they were ignored. Sometimes they were not. As the new millennium progressed, Berlin itself transformed. Construction crews uncovered relics of division, rusted cables, sealed bunkers, forgotten chambers. Occasionally, a news article speculated about hidden tunnels. Most were myths, but the myth persisted because it felt true. Berlin had lived underground for too long to ever fully escape it. Visitors today walk freely from east to west, unaware that beneath their feet once ran a passage built not for escape, but for listening. There is no plaque marking it, no monument, because intelligence history rarely allows memorials. It exists in shadows. The men and women who built the tunnel grew old. Some watched documentaries about their own work, hearing narrators describe events they had lived in silence. Some smiled. Some turned away, because history simplified what had been unbearably complex. They knew the tunnel had not been heroic, nor had it been villainous. It had been necessary, according to the logic of its time, and terrifying. As historians now assess the Berlin Tunnel, they increasingly frame it not as an operation, but as a turning point. Before Berlin, intelligence was about secrets. After Berlin, intelligence was about systems, about flows, about patterns, about assumptions. The tunnel taught the world that power no longer resided solely in weapons, but in awareness. That awareness, once unleashed, could never be buried again, not by concrete, not by walls, not by time. The tunnel collapsed physically in 1956, but conceptually it expanded. It stretched into satellites, into cables, into cyberspace, into the present. And perhaps that is the tunnel's greatest legacy, not what it heard, but what it started. A world where listening became permanent, where secrecy became fragile, where silence became suspicious. Yet even now, one truth endures. No matter how advanced surveillance becomes, it can never replace understanding. The tunnel heard voices, but it could not hear intentions. It captured words, but not wisdom. That limitation remains. The Berlin Tunnel was a warning disguised as a triumph, a reminder that knowing everything is impossible, and believing otherwise is dangerous. As the story moves towards its end, one question remains, quiet, persistent, unresolved. Did the tunnel make the world safer? Or did it merely teach humanity how to live closer to the edge? That question will not be answered by technology, only by memory.
As the Cold War faded into memory, the people who had lived inside it were left with something heavier than victory or defeat. They were left with questions. The Berlin Tunnel, once a classified operation buried beneath layers of secrecy, became a moral fault line, one that intelligence professionals, historians, and policymakers would circle again and again without ever fully crossing. Because the tunnel was never just about spying. It was about how far a society is willing to go to survive. In quiet interviews conducted decades later, former intelligence officers struggled to articulate what the tunnel meant to them. Many paused before answering. Some asked that the recorders be turned off. Others stared at the table, as if still listening for footsteps overhead. One former CIA case officer finally said, "We didn't think we were heroes. We thought we were a delay mechanism. A delay against disaster. A delay against misunderstanding. A delay against panic." That, in their minds, was enough. But delay is not prevention, and that distinction haunted them. Because even as the tunnel operated, the world came dangerously close to catastrophe again and again. Hungary in 1956, Berlin in 1961, Cuba in 1962. Each crisis carried the same question beneath it. Do we know enough to act, or enough to stop ourselves? The tunnel provided fragments, not answers. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, some senior analysts privately compared intercepted Soviet communications to those once captured in Berlin. They recognized the same patterns: ambiguity, coded language, internal disagreement. Those similarities convinced them to advise restraint. They argued that overheard words rarely reflected final decisions. That counsel mattered. The world survived. But survival did not bring clarity. As the Cold War officially ended, intelligence agencies faced a reckoning unlike any before. Their enemy had vanished, or so it seemed. Budgets were cut, missions were questioned, secrecy was challenged. And in that climate, the Berlin Tunnel resurfaced not as a tool, but as a warning from the past. New generations asked uncomfortable questions. If the tunnel had failed earlier, would it have caused war? If it had never existed, would the Cold War have ended sooner or in flames? If betrayal had not occurred, would the intelligence gained have changed history more decisively? There were no definitive answers. History does not reveal its alternate paths. What it does reveal is cost. The tunnel cost millions of dollars in 1950s currency, an enormous sum.
It cost years of human effort. It cost trust between allies, and it cost individuals their peace of mind. Yet its cost was never measured in lives. That alone distinguished it from most Cold War weapons. The moral ambiguity of the tunnel lies there, in what it did not do. It did not kill. It did not bomb. It did not conquer. It listened. And listening, paradoxically, proved more unsettling than violence, because listening forces responsibility. If you hear suffering, do you intervene? If you hear aggression, do you preempt? If you hear doubt, do you exploit or empathize? The tunnel forced intelligence officers to confront these questions in real time, without guidance, without precedent. Many carried those dilemmas into retirement. Some never resolved them. As archives opened further in the 2000s, historians uncovered details that deepened the tunnel's complexity. Internal debates, conflicting assessments, moments when analysts nearly overreacted to misinterpreted calls. In one instance, a routine logistical delay was almost mistaken for mobilization. Only careful cross-checking prevented escalation. The tunnel had nearly created the crisis it sought to prevent. That realization reframed the operation entirely. It was no longer just a feat of engineering. It was a fragile balancing act, one misstep away from disaster. In academic circles, the Berlin Tunnel became a case study in intelligence ethics. Universities debated it. Military colleges dissected it. Students argued passionately on both sides. Some praised its audacity. Some condemned its recklessness. Most acknowledged its inevitability. Because in the logic of the Cold War, not listening was the greater risk. Berlin itself, now unified, struggled with how to remember its underground past. Memorials honored victims of division, not the mechanisms of surveillance. The city chose healing over excavation. Perhaps that was wise, because the tunnel represented a Berlin that no longer wanted to exist. Yet memory persists. Every time a new surveillance scandal breaks, journalists invoke Berlin. Every time a whistleblower speaks, commentators reference Cold War secrecy. The tunnel has become shorthand for a dangerous truth. Power prefers to listen before it speaks. As the story of the tunnel approached its final chapter, one fact stood above all others. Despite betrayal, despite compromise, despite exposure, the operation did not spiral out of control. It ended, quietly, contained. That outcome was not accidental. It was the result of restraint exercised by people on both sides who understood what was at stake. The Americans shut it down without retaliation. The Soviets exposed it without escalation. In a world defined by extremes, both sides chose limits. That choice mattered. The Berlin Tunnel stands as evidence that even in the darkest moments of ideological conflict, there were invisible lines that neither side wished to cross. Those lines were not drawn by treaties. They were drawn by fear of annihilation. As we move toward the end of this story, one final truth emerges with clarity. The tunnel did not change history through what it heard. It changed history through what it restrained. It restrained panic. It restrained overconfidence. It restrained the impulse to act without understanding. In that sense, it was not an act of aggression, but an act of containment. And containment, imperfect as it was, kept the world intact long enough to change.
In the end, the Berlin Tunnel did not collapse in fire or violence. It ended in silence. No alarms screamed, no shots were fired underground, no emergency orders raced across command centers. Instead, the tunnel was sealed, documented, archived, and buried, physically and politically. That ending was deliberate,
because everyone involved understood the same unspoken truth. The most dangerous intelligence operations are not the ones that fail loudly, but the ones that succeed quietly and are misunderstood afterward. For the intelligence officers who had lived with the tunnel in their thoughts for decades, closure came slowly. Some found it in reunified Berlin, standing where the wall once stood, watching people cross freely without fear. Others found it in declassified files, finally seeing the full picture, what had been real, what had been manipulated, and what had almost gone terribly wrong. A few never found closure at all. They carried Berlin with them until the end. History, when it finally caught up to the tunnel, treated it gently. It did not condemn it outright. It did not celebrate it uncritically. Instead, it placed it where it belonged, inside the moral gray zone that defined the Cold War. The tunnel became a symbol not of domination, but of hesitation, a reminder that power, when restrained by fear of consequence, can sometimes choose listening over destruction. Standing in modern Berlin today, it is difficult to imagine the city as it once was. The scars are fading, the streets are alive, the borders are invisible. Tourists laugh where guards once watched. Cafes sit where barbed wire once cut through neighborhoods. Children play where soldiers once waited for orders that could end the world. And beneath it all, the ground is quiet. But it remembers. The tunnel is gone, but its shadow remains in how nations spy, how leaders hesitate, and how societies debate the balance between security and freedom. Every time a government justifies surveillance in the name of safety, Berlin echoes. Every time citizens question how much listening is too much, Berlin answers back with silence. What made the Berlin Tunnel extraordinary was not its engineering, though that was remarkable. It was not its secrecy, though that was unprecedented. It was the fact that it existed in a moment when humanity stood one misunderstanding away from extinction and chose, at least once, to listen instead of strike. The tunnel taught intelligence agencies that knowledge is not power by itself. Context is power. Restraint is power. Knowing when not to act is power. Those lessons were paid for in fear, secrecy, and sleepless nights beneath a divided city. They were expensive lessons, but they were lessons learned without blood. As the Cold War recedes further into history, the Berlin Tunnel grows more relevant, not less, because the modern world listens more than ever. Phones, cables, satellites, networks. We live inside a permanent tunnel now, global, invisible, and always active. The difference is that today, most people do not know when they are being heard. That is the tunnel's final warning. Listening is never neutral. Information is never harmless, and silence is never empty. The men who built the tunnel believed they were buying time, time for understanding, time for caution, time for the world to step back from the edge. History suggests they were right, at least once, and in a century defined by close calls, at least once mattered. So when we remember the Berlin Tunnel, we should not ask whether it was right or wrong. We should ask something harder. What kind of world makes such tunnels necessary? And what kind of world will finally make them obsolete? Until that answer comes, the ground beneath Berlin remains a quiet witness to a time when the fate of millions traveled through copper wires in the dark, and when listening, for all its danger, helped keep the world intact. Discover the hidden secrets beneath Berlin that changed the Cold War forever. Watch, follow, and never miss the untold story.